Checking the time. Hey there, everybody. Welcome. I'm Scott again. If you're new, my name's Scott. I'm with Artist Network, and I'm working on these live drawing sessions every Monday, Wednesday, Friday. I see a lot of familiar faces in the chat. Welcome, Tyler and Irene. Dee, I see you there. Got people from. We got Laura from Minnesota, Vivica from Miami, Marion from California, Nell from France. All right, we got people from all over the world today. As you can see, I've already gotten a start on things here. And if you've been watching from my previous series, I've been playing around with the arrangement of the cameras and screens in front of me. So when I'm looking off in different directions, I'm looking at various kind of chat fields and reference photos and things like that. So I'm trying to monitor a bunch of stuff at the same time. So just so you're curious, it's just me here in the room, so I'm not looking off to somebody else here. More people coming in. We've got from California. Hello, Sarah. George from Austria. Hello, hello. See, again, some familiar faces. Virginia, Columbia. Bunch of people from more from Georgia, Phoenix. Hello from Trinidad and Tobago. That is exciting. All right. So as you can see on the screen here, eggs. That's what we're working on today. This is a fairly classic setup. I taught drawing for many years online, actually, and this is one of the key assignments that we would establish for our students to help with value control. And I find it really helpful, again, not only for that, but for developing a sense of touch with your material. So I'm working with charcoal today, just regular drawing paper, white drawing paper. The last few exercises that I've done, I've worked with both white and black, so charcoal and chalk on top of a toned paper. In this case, I'm just working on the white paper, and I'm just going to be working with charcoal pencil, some vine charcoal, and my erasers. I've got my kneaded eraser, I've got my rubber eraser. I'm getting rid of the shading stump. I've been using that a lot lately, but I'm getting rid of that here, and I'm going to talk a bit more about that later. But especially for this assignment, I've been finding that it's really holding to the paper a bit too much, and I kind of want to avoid that for this one. I'll need to be able to do a lot of negative drawing, erasing out the highlights. There are some kind of questions. So before we get too far in the chat, early on, Coloring with D made a comment about being a bit intimidated perhaps by this process and being scared to draw, and that's something I'd like to talk about throughout this as well. It's that sense of fear that we all may have when we're drawing. It's a fairly vulnerable experience, especially if you feel like somebody else is watching. And honestly, I don't know anybody who hasn't confronted that to some degree or another throughout their art career. So I don't know really what words of wisdom I can kind of provide for that, other than I sincerely hope that you don't let that stop you from drawing. It's, like I said, everybody feels that to some degree or another, and mistakes are an essential part of the process. And after a while, you start to get excited by the mistakes, because you know that once you've become aware of them and you know how to correct them, your drawing is going to improve. That's really the best way to do that. And so you end up developing a sense where you're like, I'm not happy with this drawing, and I'm excited by that. And when I have live students, we will do a critique. What I like to do is I encourage each of my students to identify what's going well in their drawing and what needs improvement. And it has to happen. You have to have at least both of those things. You're never going to have a drawing that's 100% perfect. You're never going to have a drawing that's 100% flawed. There's always something that you're doing well in that, and you want to identify that so you can carry that on to the next drawing. You also want to identify what needs improvement, because that's something that helps move you forward. I tell my students, I say, once you get to the point where you feel like you're 100% happy, it's kind of like game over there. There's really nowhere to go. There's always something that needs to kind of pull you. There's something that you want to work on, that you can sink your teeth into while you're working. So we want to try to get rid of that idea that there is such thing as a perfect drawing and it has to be perfect in order for you to do it. Think about the drawing, the act of drawing, more than the drawing itself. And if you're not enjoying drawing, and then it's going to show in the drawing at the end here. So those are just kind of some of my thoughts, and I might circle back around to that as I think about it. But if anybody else is experiencing that same thing where there's a sense of intimidation, the best way you can do it is just to start doing it. You don't have to share your work with anybody. Just enjoy the process as much as you can. You know, pay attention to how your reaction to it, and just continue to kind of move forward, continue to practice, and try to ignore the final product at the end if you're really kind of worried about it. So I want to before I get too far, we got a lot of people chiming in here. We've got some from Ontario, UK, all right, North Carolina, California. All right, another from Florida, New York. Hello, everybody. Carol, Renee, Linda. All right. Feel free to shout out if you have any questions about what I'm doing here. I see a question: have you addressed how you sharpen your pencils? I've actually kind of done it two ways. I use a sharp blade to sharpen this one to expose more of the core, the charcoal core there. And then I'll kind of file it down to a point, and I can use sandpaper to help kind of grind that down. I like that just so that especially as I'm building up charcoal, I might use this pencil a bit more, and I'm using that on the side of my pencil, so that's kind of always kind of refining the edge as much as possible. But because I have more charcoal exposed, it gets me a little bit farther along in the drawing. But then I also have this pencil here, and I've sharpened it on both ends just using a standard pencil sharpener. Having it sharpened on both ends just allows me to kind of pivot to a new point when I need to. And so that's just the way I do it. And I know some artists they'll expose even more of that charcoal in the core, but you want to kind of use whatever is kind of comfortable for you. And it all depends. Sometimes having a really sharp point is actually detrimental to the drawing, depending on the subject. Sometimes it's exactly what you need. And I tend to really only want to use a very sharp point at the very end, because I want my marks to be kind of loose. I want them to move around. If I engage the point of the pencil too early and I create a darker mark, it's really hard to erase that out later. So once I'm 100% confident I know where a mark needs to go, then I might use kind of that sharper point there. Then I've got my vine charcoal, and I really don't do anything with that, but you can see it. I don't know if you can kind of see it, but this one's been kind of ground down almost in half because I use this on its side to build up just kind of layers of charcoal. So as you can see, I had kind of started by laying out the shape of the eggs here, just kind of loosely. One of the things that is really challenging with the eggs is that there's no real kind of grain or structure. There's no hard lines to help define the shape. It's really all about these subtle shifts in value as you move from the highlight into the shadow, trying to find that line of termination where it stops being light and moves into the shadow, and where there might be a shadow core. So what you're going to see me do as I'm building up these values is using this light circular mark. So again, I'm holding the pencil really far back. That allows me to just let the pencil scrape across the paper. I'm just using the weight of the charcoal pencil as I'm doing this, trying to work in circular marks to help eliminate any sort of kind of hatch marks as much as possible. And just starting to build up values, and I'm looking for the shadow shapes. And so I've kind of identified the edges of the forms, but I want to ignore them at this point and start thinking about the overall shape of the shadow and where those shadows are going to be. I'm not too concerned about the highlights, and one of the reasons I got rid of the shading stump that I've been using a lot lately is that it really forces the charcoal into the paper. And I don't want that in this drawing. I want to be able to erase out to that bright white of the paper, especially in these highlight areas. So I'm going to use the side of my hand that I've been doing quite a bit lately to shade. Now, one of the other things I liked about this setup is that with the grain of that wood underneath the eggs, it provides a nice contrast in texture. So I can see the softness and the smoothness of the eggs, and against the slightly rougher surface. And also, if you notice in that shadow, you can continue to see the texture of that wood through that shadow. And that's not something we've really addressed in any of the drawing exercises so far. because the shadows have largely been on a very smooth surface. And so a lot of what this drawing is going to be about is what's happening in the shadow areas that are cast onto that wood surface, and really confronting the transparency of that. A lot of what I'm doing right now is just kind of thinking through the process. Now, as I start to work on the blocking in the shadows that are being cast onto the wood surface, I want to be thinking about the grain of the wood. And you can see this was taken at an angle. And so you can see subtle marks in the wood that suggest the perspective of that plane, and that's going to be a really helpful tool for me. And so as I'm blocking this in, I want to start to use marks that reflect that structure. So you can see here on this side, there's a line kind of angling in as it goes towards the back edge. When we get over to here, the line in the wood becomes largely vertical. And then as we move across, it starts to radiate out from what appears to be a point above the paper. And so they're not vertical lines, they're not diagonal, they're kind of radiating out. And so if you can find the point at which that line becomes vertical, look to the right to see where it angles in, look to the left to see where it angles in, and then you can start to allow your hatch marks to reflect those angles. And so again, as I'm building up those values, what I'm doing is I'm thinking about that, because all of these hatch marks are going to help to simulate the texture of the wood later on. If I start hatching like this, kind of contrary to that, it's going to work against me. I'm going to have to get rid of those hatch marks in order to simulate the grain of the wood. So this is all going to serve me later in the drawing if I have an awareness of the angle of the grain on the surface of that the eggs are sitting on. And it's actually, I shot it on this board. It's really pretty wild to see the change in color here, but for my camera, it changed the hue a little bit. But this is this drawing surface that actually had set the eggs up on. So what I might do is kind of lightly scribe this vertical line to show where the perspective of that wood becomes more vertical, and that will help me to start to think about how the grain kind of radiates out from that central point. And so here, some of my marks are actually too angled. It's not creating that transition out as we radiate. So I can continue to adjust that. I'm not worried about getting it right the first time, but if I'm moving in generally the right direction, it's going to help. And if I know that these angles are going to ultimately angle in this way over here, again, I want to kind of think about radiating a bit more. It's going to be a lot of buildup in this drawing. This one actually may take a bit longer than some of the previous ones, so hope you'll stick around. But if you do have to step away, all of this becomes available to you on YouTube. You can continue to watch the recording of it. We're going to kind of miss out on the live chat, so I encourage you to kind of stay through the entire drawing. So at least getting some of these lines in. One of the things I talk a lot about with my students is the idea that you want to get marks on the paper early, because then what the drawing becomes about is about reacting to what's there. Without anything on the page, it's hard to identify what the correct mark is going to be. The analogy that I use is that of putting together a jigsaw puzzle, where it's a pretty rare person, to find a person who can reach into a box of pieces, pull it out, look at it, know exactly where it goes in the final piece, put it on the table, never to move it again. What you do instead is we tend to take a bunch of pieces, pour them out, and as we gather information about what's on each piece, they're moving around, right? And then they lock into place eventually. And that's exactly the way we want to think about our drawings here is right now we're just throwing pieces onto the surface, and then as we gather information about the objects in front of us, about the proportions, the perspective, about the values, and then we move them around until they kind of lock into place. So one of the advantages of holding the pencil on its side like this is that it allows the charcoal to just really stay on the surface of the paper and erase more effectively, more easily. All right, this is looking just like a lot of haziness. I want to kind of soften this out a little bit so those hatch marks are still going to be visible. So if I'm using the side of my hand here to kind of smooth it out, I'm really losing the form. Just kind of building up value. And I might use the vine charcoal. If I'm using the vine charcoal, I want to be thinking about it the same way. There's a little crinkle down in here, so I'm not super worried about that. I want to be thinking about building up value, but using the hatch marks to ultimately help me gain an understanding of the perspective of the drawing. All right, let's see what else do we have here. Oh, I might have missed some questions as they came through, but hello from Toronto. He said, a college instructor is never to throw out the garbage drawing because you learn so much from them. And that is exactly true. I guess I've been making art for almost 40 years, about 7 years in training. And there's a lot of stuff that I've thrown out. But if you're not learning from it, you're kind of missing an opportunity. You just kind of do a lot of work. Going back to that concept of being afraid, one of the things that can be really intimidating about art is that we'll often go to a museum or a gallery show, we'll see this beautiful set of finished works, and we'll just be in awe about the artist's ability. What we're missing are the hundreds, if not thousands, of quote-unquote failed paintings that it takes to get to that point. And sometimes we're even looking at them directly. We'll look at kind of the finished paintings will actually be painted on top of kind of studies or less effective paintings. And so I know I do that all the time. I'll work on a painting. If I don't like it, I don't want to waste a board, so I'll just paint on top of it. And sometimes that underpainting becomes useful in the painting that I go on top, or I'll just take another stab at it. But there's a lot of kind of missteps that are necessary on the way, and you kind of have to make those mistakes in order to get to the gold in your drawing. Just kind of building up value here. This is really kind of tricky. And you can see I'm kind of losing the form of the eggs. That's all right. I can see the lines kind of lightly on my paper here. And I'll get back to them. And one of the things that can be really helpful is just to get rid of the white. One of the things I mentioned before is that value is relative. And so we're always calibrating our awareness or understanding of a value based on the values that are around it. And so as soon as we start making marks on the page, those marks are in the context of the white of the page. We can't go any whiter than that. And so as a result, it's actually skewing our perception of those marks. Initially, they're going to look dark, but as you start to build up other values, you realize that those initial marks are actually much lighter than they may have first appeared. So just kind of keep that in mind. I'm just building up values, but if I'm going to build up those values, I want these marks to be useful to me. But I'm not really paying a whole lot of attention to making them correct. All right, let's see. I'm going to come back later and erase out some of these highlights, but I know they're going to get kind of buried in tone as I build up these values here. I think about the shadow shapes here. So a combination of the shadow that's on the form of the egg with the shadow that's being cast on the surface. And so this is where, and again, an awareness of the marks comes in handy, because as I'm thinking over here about the cast shadow, there's this overall shape, and I can see this curve along here. But if I make a line that curves like this, it's actually going to kind of pop off the surface. What I want to do is create an edge out of marks that run vertically, and they just happen to end at that point. And that's going to help simulate the transparency of the shadow. So I'm thinking about the general path that shadow makes, but I'm using marks that reflect the texture of the wood, the grain of the wood, because that's ultimately what I'm looking at. I'm not looking at a shadow, I'm looking at a board that's in shadow in this area. All right, let's see, anybody else? Hello, more from the UK, this is fantastic. You're welcome. Thank you all for joining me here. So, oh, thank you, Vivica. I noticed that in one of the watching back one of my older ones, that my head kind of tips in like this, and I had written a note to remind myself, and I forgot to read the note. So I appreciate the comment. If the volume is off at all, or if I'm blocking the shot, feel free to call that out. I'm definitely not offended at all for any suggestions that are going to improve the experience. So, all right, let's see. Now that I've kind of got this kind of blocked in, that vine charcoal helps to create some values. I'm going to build up some values there a little bit later, but I want to kind of sink my teeth into the eggs because this is starting to look like a whole lot of nothing right now. So when I'm going to be erasing, I need to be looking again at the proportions, the angles. I'm going to use this. Actually, I'm finding that I've got a screen off to the left now that has the reference on it as well, and I'm feeling like that's perhaps a bit better for me to look at. In this drawing, I've kind of increased the scale of the eggs a little bit. I'm zooming in from the reference, mostly just as kind of a personal kind of compositional choice that I made. I don't know if there's any really reason for that. Sometimes I like to if I have a singular object or a cluster, something a small central focal point in a field like this. Sometimes I actually like to make it smaller than it actually is and provide more space around it. Sometimes I can pull the viewer in a bit more, kind of give them a larger environment within which they can rest their eyes, and it creates a different connection with the object. It's kind of like looking at a Rembrandt portrait. If you look at Rembrandt, there's often far more space around the head than you might think. The face is so engaging, you get pulled in, and then once you're in the painting, there's all the space around it, and it just pulls you into the face even more. And so you might check that out sometime and realize that our brain, our mind can really kind of latch on to that subject, but it's actually not taking up a lot of the space in the image. So in this case, I'm actually kind of expanding that a little bit more. I guess it was a good choice. I don't know. We'll see at the end how this all turns out. What do I want to do? I'm going to work my way from left to right on this one because I've got already a lot of charcoal built up on my hands. I know this is going to kind of smudge as we move across. And what I want to do is I'll probably be working back and forth between the surface of the board and the eggs here. So there's going to be some negative drawing, kind of erasing out of the forms, kind of like you saw me do with the highlight on the egg. All right, let's see. What I like about it, and I've talked about this in some of the other drawings as well, is that alternating pattern of light and dark, where we have, it's darker, goes to light, goes to the dark of the eggs, into light again, into dark, more dark, light, light above it. So there is this kind of interesting balance between light and dark areas. And I think what I want to do now is, I want to think my way through the egg, keeping these marks really light and loose. I might use line selectively around the edge to pop a form a bit more, but I really want to be careful because I like the three-dimensional quality of the eggs, and I don't want them to flatten out. If I draw a line that is too hard, it'll flatten that out. So I'm just kind of reestablishing that edge, but I want that edge to feel like it's been consumed by the background. And maybe what I'll do is start to apply some texture here. I'm going to look at, feel like I think I've exaggerated the angles a bit on this that surface plane, but I can start to correct that. Perhaps got a bit overzealous in my awareness of that perspective there. This is a good example of one-point perspective for anybody who's studied linear perspective as a tool to create depth. All of these lines are converging at a singular point directly above this vertical edge. So if I can kind of hold in my mind where that point is, it helps me to find the correct angle I'm looking at. And I want these lines to continue through. Drawing from the shoulder, locking the wrist, that's going to help create a straighter line. So as long as I'm roughly in the ballpark with these angles, it's going to help to reinforce the grain of the wood. So much of what's going to define the texture of the eggs is actually the contrast against that wood grain. So it's kind of an important aspect of this drawing here. And it's one of the reasons I chose to set it on wood instead of just a smooth white surface that some of the other objects have been on. All right, hello from Kansas. We have Laura. From Texas. Is it Avli? Hello. We have Ruth from Germany. This tape here, Melanie, is to actually hold the paper down and to provide an edge. So it's kind of twofold. You know, sometimes I don't necessarily tape all the way around in my drawings, but it does provide a nice border. And in this case, it just kind of locks it down. If I wasn't filming and if I wasn't in this kind of scenario, I might not tape it down so securely. I might just have a few pieces at the top to keep it from shifting too much. And then at the end, you kind of pull up the tape, you got that nice clean edge. If you were to frame this, if we were to frame an image that is taped, then it provides a nice border for the framer to use to cut a mat. All right, now, again, it's kind of building up those values. And you're going to see me redefine this edge multiple times. So then, you know, as this darkens here, and I may artificially darken it, just make it very subtle. I'm not worried about confronting the edge. I'm going to let these marks go right over the edge if I need to, and if I keep my marks light enough, I'm going to be able to erase those back out. I just want to avoid kind of being too careful about coming up to the edge, because that tends to leave a halo which destructs the form a bit. So I'm going to use this image here. All right, let's see. Wipe that down, cut this back out. It's a lot of pushing and pulling the drawing, establishing marks, laying them down, lifting them off, darkening, etc. I'm going to start working on this egg now because I'm feeling pretty confident about that value. I can come back in later and correct and add some more of that grain of the wood. Right now I really want to work on this part. And I love here this transition as you follow along the edge. It's a smooth transition to light where it's against a darker background, but as you come over here, it becomes darker against now what feels like a lighter background. So there's very little value shift in that background but there's that strong contrast in the egg, and that's really what's creating that sense of the three-dimensional form. So you just use natural light when I took this photo. But I set them up in such a way that you have that. I didn't want the light to be blasting them, so it's just pure white, because then there's no light and shadow information to help create the form that's necessary in the drawing. So yeah, I carefully kind of laid these out in a way that reinforces the volume. It just gives me more tools to use in my drawing. Like I said, if this was just if this was just washed with light, then these would just be white ovals, and it wouldn't give me a whole lot of information. And it would, looking at the final drawing, it would just feel like it's a series of white ovals on a flat surface rather than eggs. So keeping the marks light and loose using these circular marks, I'm just using the weight of the pencil. And if I need more, if I need it to be darker, if I need a darker value, I'm just kind of leaning into it, just ever so gradually. I'm just kind of gripping the pencil a bit more as I start to darken these areas. And I'm looking for areas where it might be a little bit inconsistent in the value. I'm also looking back and forth between my drawing and the reference photo to see really where the darkest part is. There's no clear line of termination. There's no sharp edge on the shadow for me to really identify. But there is a noticeable gradation of value that I can use, and I want to identify where the darkest parts are. There's a part right in here where the value of the egg and the value of that table are very similar to one another. I'm going to let that just be a lost and found edge. You can see right in this area, if you have the reference photo open, or if you can see it on the screen well enough, it gets a little bit lighter here. There's light bouncing, it's coming over this first egg, bouncing off the second one, back onto the first egg, and that's what's creating that bounce light. And I want to be careful not to overstate it. Once you become aware of it, in your mind it tends to take greater prominence. And one of the things that I see beginning students do is they overstate that bounce light. It's kind of like it's something that's so interesting and attractive that you want to get it in there, you want to show that you've really observed it. And then if it becomes too intense, it starts to compete with the real highlight over here, and then it flattens out that form. So let's see, how's that forming? Can you kind of see the form building here? Just using the side of my finger to kind of smooth that out a little bit. It's actually a nice texture to this paper that creates this kind of nice eggshell effect naturally. So it's kind of working to my advantage. Let me see here. There's kind of a more value over here. The brightest point on the highlight is right here. The light's coming in this direction. So I can kind of let the values build up in this area over here. This gets really tricky, so maybe I need to darken this a little bit more. Oh, from Ontario. I'm here, beautiful Colorado, where it was, what was it, 70 degrees the other day. Beautiful, sunny. Woke up yesterday morning, had to scrape my windshield. It was something else. Seems like there's been some weird weather all across the country. All right, let me see. I think I've established where the shadow core is here enough, but I think I need to darken this part over here. And if you keep those marks light and loose, you can really kind of sneak up on the values. If I was using the tip of the pencil right now, it would make the marks that are too permanent and really start to affect the overall gradation of value that I'm trying to establish. I want this to be smooth. So this is all about kind of sensitivity and touch, being aware of subtle shifts in value, but also training the hand to be equally as subtle. And that's where this kind of overhand grip, this hand is just kind of resting on the surface. So really, my arm is not doing a whole lot. I just need to move it around, locking the wrist, and letting the weight of the pencil do what it does as much as possible. If I need to, I just kind of rotate my wrist a little bit, grip the pencil a little bit more, and that'll make a slightly darker mark. But it's kind of like pushing on a gas pedal. Just if I need a little bit more charcoal, I'll lean in. If I need less, I'll just let up and just let it scrape across the surface. If I need to smooth out that transition, do this, come back in and reestablish that highlight yet again. So I'm just going to keep erasing that highlight using the kneaded eraser to kind of feather it out if I need to. So I don't want it to be a sharp edge. All right. And one of the things that's really going to help to define this form is to lock this shadow in under here. So I want to make sure that I'm perceiving the form of this egg that's overlapping it correctly. Define that form a little bit. What you would have seen me do in previous drawings is attack curves as a series of short, straighter edges. So that's kind of what I'm thinking here. I try not to hit it in one mark. I'm letting those marks kind of accumulate together. So if I can see that form there, that helps. And then what I can do is build this value in the shadow under here. So there's this cast shadow. And now this is where the awareness of the grain of the wood is going to be really helpful, because I want these marks to reflect that. Just kind of gripping the pencil a little bit harder to create a harder mark. Not too worried about going over the edge of this egg, so I can erase that back out, as long as I'm not being too hard with it. And you can see some bounce light here. Light is bouncing off this side of the egg here onto this surface. But again, I don't want to overstate that. What I might do actually is just darken the area, the border around it, to establish that light. So before I erase out anything in here, I want to make sure I get the value of the board, the surface, correct first. And so as I was saying earlier, with this sharpening technique, I've been using the side of the pencil a lot, and I still have that really fine point there that I can use now in an area like this. Trying to think through that path. But you can see there's this small kind of triangle of that shadow core that's being cast on the surface. So as I'm drawing a contour line, I really want to be careful because I don't want that contour line to be too harsh. And I kind of had forgotten about the grain a bit there when I was doing this cast shadow, so I just need to make sure that I'm not creating marks that are going to kind of work against me as I create that edge. How's that feel? You can see how much that really does to define that form. We're talking about lost and found edges, which is something that we've covered quite a bit. This is a kind of a good example of that. You know, just by establishing this edge along here, it allows our mind to fill in the gap. So we can be subtle with our marks and our edges sometimes. And let that edge just kind of diffuse a little bit. It creates a sense of atmosphere. And then you can also use that contrast to your advantage to create depth, kind of like a camera uses focus and exposure to create kind of a depth of field. we can do that in drawing. Being selective with where edges become sharp can be really helpful. So maybe I let that soften along here. This feels like it's a bit too ambiguous. Let me darken that. Use my eraser to define that edge first before I go in there with a line. Oh, I'm coming into the camera a bit. So glad you mentioned that earlier. Here we go. So just being selective in certain areas to help that form. And I don't want to, again, I don't want to overstate it. I'd rather sneak up on that. And so I'm going to let that be as it is right now. And if I feel like this form is still too soft, if it's too much of a lost and found edge, then I can always come back in and define it more later. So. And then, as you can see, by leaving this area alone, it's starting to create the suggestion of that bounce light without having to erase out that light. So I want to just continue to darken, following the grain of the wood. Looking at the screen to my left, where I think I actually have a better glimpse of the egg there. Ingrid from Germany. Very therapeutic. I'm glad to hear that. That's really kind of one of the main reasons we're doing this. I mean, there's a lot of information out there, and I'm here to provide whatever information I can. But really, the goal with this series is to provide a break from other media out there that could be challenging right now. I think it's important that we're all taking the time to just let our minds just come into focus, be present in this moment. And that's, to me, what making art is all about. Drawing in particular. Drawing is such a kind of a primal thing in the sense that, we've been doing this. We have evidence of drawing that dates, 40,000 years. And to me, the real power in drawing is when we consider the idea that marks are thoughts, that everything that we're seeing, every mark that I'm making here on the page, every mark that you're making, is some sort of record of your thought process. And we start to look at some of those ancient cave paintings, petroglyphs. We're not all that far from areas of the country here where you can see these petroglyphs from our ancient ancestors, and seeing those marks, it's like it's a bit of a form of mind reading, where we're seeing evidence of a thought process behind the marks that are being made. And so there's something about it that causes us to do this as people. So I like to just go with it. All right. Now you can see that egg is forming over on this side, kind of working my way down. But I might actually, before I get to this, I'm thinking about structure, and maybe I should move to this egg back here so that I can establish that and then really put this one on top, rather than build this one on top and then try to sneak that egg in behind it. So I want to start to think about this form. Thinking about that shadow that's being cast across here. That was another calculated choice as I was setting this up, is having a shadow that's being cast from one object to the other, from one egg to the other, because again, it helps to showcase the form of the eggs and establish the spatial relationships. So it helps us to see that one egg is in front of the other. And so they're clustered together this way to create overlapping, which gives us visual tools in the drawing to suggest depth. If I had spaced these out, I'm restricting the tools I have available to me, and I run the risk of the drawing itself being flat. And so then in that case, I could do everything right in the drawing, get it dialed in exactly the way I see it, but it'll still feel flat because I'm not utilizing other tools like overlapping. And so here I have this form overlapping the shadow to help show that this is in front of that. And then there's overlapping of the forms as well as overlapping of the shadows. So just consider that as you're staging your own still lifes. Set them up in such a way that they provide an advantage to you in the end here. I'm kind of bouncing around every now and then. I'm working on this area, but I'm kind of stepping back, coming back to it, stepping back. Part of that is just to kind of gather my thoughts, and because there's focus happening here, and sometimes I just need to go back to another area where I don't have to think too much and just move the drawing along with perhaps less focus. Okay, so there's a subtle kind of path here of the shadow that I want to establish. There's really kind of a compound shadow effect happening here, where there's a light form shadow and then a darker form shadow, and that's what I wanted to be able to capture. So some of these marks, these hatch marks, are getting a little heavy. Need to soften those out. Smooth that out. I'm not going to erase that. I don't need to because I know I'm going to get that dirty again. Where is that? Right in here. There's this turn here in the shadow. This is going to be really tricky in here because there are a lot of dark values, but there are just these subtle shifts that I want to be aware of. Because I want to make sure I'm not going too dark with the egg. So I'm not, in this area here, I'm not worrying about the overall form of the egg at this point, because I know that the shadow that's cast on the surface, that's cast by the egg, is really dark. And so I can come in on top of that, and that's what's going to define that edge. And because it's darker, it really doesn't matter what I'm doing down in here. Those darker marks are going to consume the marks that I'm making now. But as I move up here, now the egg appears darker against that lighter background, and so I want to be a bit more sensitive to this area. I want to build up some of those values. I don't want that to be white because I don't want that to compete with the highlight. So I want to make sure that there's some value there, and then the value of the egg gets darker. All right. Hello, everybody. 2B, yeah. Actually, I think that's what I'm using right now. Is I'm working with a 2B. To me, that works perfectly. I feel like it's a really nice, versatile tool. It's hard enough to provide the details. It's soft enough to build up values. And I feel like I can move through the entire drawing with just this one pencil when I need it. All right. So here, I want to define this form here. So I want to be careful with the line that I'm making. I don't want this line to be too dark. And I want it to be consumed by the shadow form, the form shadow of the egg here. It's going to keep building up this value. And then over here we get this kind of cast shadow. And along here, I don't know, I'm not getting this form right now quite correctly, but I need to see that a little bit more clearly. In the previous drawing, that was the lemons. It's a bit more forgiving of a form because they're, as an organic form, they grow in generally the same shape and size, but there's a lot of variation within that, and that allows your drawing to be have a bit more forgiveness there in terms of getting the proportions right. But with an egg, it's, for some reason, it feels like it needs to be a bit more precise. There can be a lot of variation in the form of eggs, but the forms of eggs, let's see. Be careful. This is all in shadow here too, so I can let this all be one shadow shape. Okay. This is a bit more hypnotic than some of the previous ones. I'm finding myself being entranced by these quick circular motions that I'm making here. So hopefully this adds to the therapeutic sensation that we talked about earlier and not sheer boredom. But I understand if that's what's happening. I am definitely not bored. This is part of, again, what I love about drawing is that sense that focus and the attention during this time allows me to just step away from things. It's kind of like highway hypnosis when you're driving home along a route that you're very familiar with, and you get home and you're like, oh my God, I don't remember any of that. How did that happen? Just lost in thought, or if you're talking with somebody, maybe you're lost in that conversation. That's what happens here as well. How do I feel? Yeah, I feel like I'm missing this form here, but I need to ask myself if that is a big deal. I feel like I need to move this shadow across a bit more and then go from there. Maybe I think just made the shadow too narrow, too off center. Build this up here. I feel like the shadow core is really right in this area, but it's a very soft transition into that shadow core, so I want my marks to be that equally as subtle. And there's kind of, the high point of the highlight is kind of back here. There's also a nice high point right here that I can be aware of. Let me kind of smooth that out, reestablish that, and that may affect it. I don't know if I'm gonna necessarily correct this form too much. So I feel like it's still working overall to create an awareness and understanding of the egg here. So like I said, I feel like I'm missing that form just a little bit, but close enough. Not gonna freak out about it. All right, and then I feel like what I need to do is kind of selectively darken this. And so sometimes in a form like this, if you keep your line really fine, from a distance it starts to disappear, but it's enough to really define that edge without flattening it out. So you just want to kind of be careful when outlining a three-dimensional form like this. All right, so I'm going to start to work in this area here. Again, keeping an awareness on the grain of the wood. Yeah, I think this drawing is going to run a little bit longer than the previous ones. We'll see. If you've got friends that you want to tell us about, I'd love to have more people join. More the merrier. All right, so I've got some kind of subtle values here. I do want to kind of establish this edge. It's even though it's very subtle, can be enough to really kind of clarify what's going on. Our eyes, our brains are very adept at perceiving subtle shifts in value, subtle angles and marks and stuff, and that's in part because we're really good at seeing subtle facial expressions and shifts there. And so sometimes it takes just very little to really establish that perspective. So getting this angle right, even though it's a very light and soft mark, is really critical for establishing that perspective. If this was off, it would have a much bigger impact in the overall drawing. Okay. Here we go. So now what I want to do is start to work on this cast shadow here. And I can use this kind of negative drawing to establish the form of the egg. Under here. I'll come back and work on that egg a bit more. And I want to be aware of this path. What is that path? This shadow here, there's kind of a line that comes across here. So I'm not kind of maybe lightly scribing it, but it's more about understanding where it goes, locking that in on my mind, and understanding the value shifts here. So there's kind of a dark core, but also kind of a path along there that the values follow, the shadow follows. So about a negative drawing now. Let's see. I'm going to sneak up on that, that shadow core, that cast shadow core. I haven't really addressed this egg so far. Most of what I'm seeing here is created by working on the space around it. Let's see. I'm finding that because of the position of this, where I am in relation to the page, it's more difficult to use my arm to draw, so I'm using my wrist a bit more, and it's creating these curved marks that I really need to be careful with. Otherwise, actually what it will do is it'll make the surface feel like it's curved when it's not. So building up values. Kind of an awkward hand position, so this is where if it wasn't taped down, I'd actually be turning this right now to give myself something to really work with in terms of the angles. But that's what it is. All right, first time here. You're watching Bob Ross before this, awesome. Bob got a lot of people interested in art. Karen has a question about watching the previous sessions. Yes, you can. There's a playlist on the Artist Network YouTube page right there at the top that of the Drawing Together series, so you can go all the way back. This is number 6, so there's the other 5 are available as well. And I've been trying to find my groove with these things, adjusting them as they go, but they're largely the same, similar kind of format here. And what I'm doing with this series is, we're all kind of in this very similar boat. No matter where you are in the world, I imagine the impact of this kind of pandemic is affecting you similarly to some degree, and we're all spending more time indoors than maybe we anticipated at this time of year. Could be a good time to pull out the pencils, pull out a paintbrush, and make some good art. And that's really the motivation here, is just to, I really need this for myself, is taking time to make art. And it's something that's easily neglected, but I'm finding it tremendously valuable personally to be able to take this time with everybody. And so even if you're not drawing here, if it's inspiring you to draw, hopefully you're taking the time to do this as well. I think it's just an excellent time to kind of sharpen your skills. Drawing is something I often really neglect. With limited time, I'll often default to painting. That's really my but I'm finding that drawing is suiting my position very well. I'm naturally mostly a plein air painter, so I get out and paint, which is becoming more challenging. I can do it to some degree, but I think really I can make best use of my time, be safest by staying indoors and drawing, and all of this is going to translate into my painting. It's about developing hand-eye coordination. It's about developing focus, letting your mind focus here on something. Shaking things up a bit, doing these small still lives has been really enjoyable as well. So if you are kind of naturally a landscape painter, a portrait painter, switching up subjects can be tremendously valuable. Maybe that's something we can share here. Anybody want to kind of share what kind of work you do? Any particular subject, medium that you enjoy working with? All right, I'm going to continue to build up value. This is a lot of build up. This drawing is emerging perhaps a bit more slowly than the previous drawings. That's all right, it is what it is. Go at its own pace. Everybody works at a very different pace, and I learned that very early on in art school, where some drawings I would work on, some paintings I would work on, sometimes I'm taking forever to get them done, sometimes I'm done in an hour, and people are spending 2 days on theirs. And that's one of the nice things about working with other people is understanding how brains process information differently. We all have kind of different motivations, different ways of seeing. And sometimes you can take what you learned from somebody else, apply it to yours, and it's exactly what you need. Sometimes it's not. Sometimes you look at something and you say, oh, I wish I could do that. And then you do it and you say, well, that's not who I am. I typically actually don't do work that's super realistic. I try not to. I get a little antsy working on my work. All right, what do we have here? Water mixable oils, colored pencils, watercolors. Sarah, we have a 9-year-old. Hello, welcome. Is that Sarah? It's excellent. You mostly seem to watch other people make art. Well, that's inspiring, but hopefully this gets you going and to make your own work there. Mixed media life, yeah. There's something enjoyable about watching other people work. I work with artists regularly. The job here at Artist Network is I often behind the camera as a producer for a lot of the art videos that we have on Artist Network TV, and so I get to watch some of these great artists come in and do their thing on camera, and oh man, and sometimes I forget that I need to be taking notes, right? I need to be watching. I'm producing a video here. I need to be focused on that video. When I get so engrossed with what they're doing, and then I'll often find that I run home and I need to try it. I had never really worked with pastels, and then I filmed a course with a really great pastelist, Christine Ivers, and she helped me get set up. She said, this is what you need. And I ordered them that day, and I fell in love with them. I don't do it enough. But there's a lot of value in just watching other people work. Hopefully they'll get you making work yourself. All right, so I feel like this is coming together. I could kind of continue to work on this area forever, but I want to get that final egg done, and then I think it's really just a matter of working with some of the details here to make sure that this feels like wood, maybe soften some of the areas, because I can use some selective focus here by softening that background there, maybe popping out the form of the eggs a little bit here, adding more detail in that foreground, so then it really feels like we're looking at a plane that's receding more. Okay, all right, that's feeling pretty good. Although I feel like I can can come in here and darken this even more, just right here in the shadow core. All right, and there's a shadow core under here in the cast shadow. All right, let's see what else we have. Charles pursuing watercolor, pencil, watercolor, collage, assemblage, and textile. That's a nice variety there. Huh. Watercolors and inks. Mixed media life. All right. Jim likes to draw. All right, yeah. I'm glad you'll draw. I mean, drawing to me, you know, it's a way of developing hand-eye coordination. It's not necessarily a prerequisite to doing it, you know, and you're gonna improve if you draw. But in my mind, if you can write, and generally we all learn to write at a fairly young age, you have sufficient ability to get moving, get drawing. That's really all the hand-eye coordination you need, and then it'll to get initiated, and then you'll continue to draw from there. So you'll grow. Define this a little bit more. All right, so now I want to start to build up the values here, being aware of the shadow core. There is kind of an interesting shape of the shadow here, as well as one that kind of moves this way. So I'm kind of seeing a form like this and a form like this in terms of the shadows. So I'm going to kind of lighten these up here. And some of those light marks may have been a little bit too heavy. All right. Oh, Marie, I keep forgetting that. Yeah, you're logging into Charles's account, and I keep forgetting that. All right. Drawing ATC cards. What is... A lot of you are drawing on ATC cards. What is... There's a silent runner is saying you work on ATC cards. What is that? Curious. Mixed media. Oh gosh, you know, the mixed media work is amazing. Just especially just exploring materials. You know, as an oil painter, sometimes I'll work in pastel, or I'll grab some watercolors, grab some pencils, and work. But I get kind of locked into those kind of core media, that core media. So, I think it's something that I should definitely be incorporating into my work more, is experimenting with surfaces, experimenting with materials, see what they do. It can be immensely gratifying, and it's one of those things that I neglect, just like drawing sometimes. I really struggle with abstraction and trusting abstraction, but it's something I'd like to get better at as well. I tend to overanalyze things and then default to trying to make things look correct, because that's more generally the way what comes easiest to my brain. But I really look at some abstract and mixed media artists, and I admire what they're doing, and I kind of wish I had some of that quality in my work. It makes me want to pull out some mixed media tools, maybe even some inks here, maybe play around with some different surfaces. Yeah, this form here, again, I'm not feeling confident in the forms. I don't know as if I really nailed them. I feel like the angle of this egg is a bit off, but I think it's good enough for today. I don't know if it's worth correcting, because this is really less about those forms and more about value relationships. It's not necessarily about the correct proportions as much as developing the sense of touch, studying these value relationships. There's too much of a halo over here, so I'm just using my palm to kind of smooth things out a little bit, because I can always redefine an edge along here if I need to. But I want to be careful to not overstate some of this kind of reflected light. So. All right, how's this doing? I've got so much charcoal built up on the side of my hands, I can actually use this to draw with a bit more effectively, and it helps to create that gradation of value. Let me pull out the highlight along here again. Yes, that's feeling all right. Maybe a bit sharp right in here. That transition in the highlight perhaps a bit too strong, so I want to soften that out. All right, let's see. Thank you for sticking around for this one. Has everybody been making your own versions of these? I'm kind of curious how people are using these. If you've been following along with the series, have you been printing them out and making your own drawings, setting up your own still life, doing something completely different and just getting inspired, perhaps, or just needing something to watch? I'd be curious how people are actually utilizing these and what you're getting out of it. Oh, artist trading cards. Huh. I need to check that out. Size of baseball cards. That's awesome. I don't know how I missed that. I've never heard of those before. I know we as artists, we can kind of fall into our own kind of bubbles here. So this is really cool to learn about these things. Artist trading cards. Right. Well, you're welcome. Teeny tiny work. They're mostly 1 inch. Holy smokes, that's tiny. 1 inch square. Drawing along. L is drawing along. Excellent. All right, Silent Runner. Well, I learned one thing about doing shadow on objects. Don't use the sun, huh? Yeah, I guess that can be a bit intense, huh? This photograph was taken just with the light coming in from an open window to reduce the number of light sources. Often when trying to photograph things indoors, there's multiple lights on, and it can cause some trouble with the light, with the shadows. So, all right, so I'm feeling pretty good about this. I want to darken this area right in here, and I'm feeling pretty good about the form of the eggs. Kind of lost it a little bit along in here. So I may, let me see if I can kind of sharpen that and then drop that value a bit more here. So I want to think about, perhaps using this kneaded eraser to help kind of reinforce the grain of the wood. What I like about the kneaded eraser is that it's such an irregular object that it can create some really interesting forms. So if I'm going to try to simulate the kind of the grain of the wood, I can create some of these lighter areas. And if I'm really just following the directionality of that wood, I can let the kneaded eraser kind of do what it does. How's that feel? I'll look at that. It's getting there. So now I want to shift my attention to this foreground area. This is all going to be about the grain of the wood. So I talked about that earlier in this. One of the things about this setup is it allows me to really see the transparency of the shadow, because the grain of the wood, transitions from an area where it's in light into that shadow. And right now, this shadow is fairly dense. It starts to suggest the texture of the wood, but I can enhance that a little bit more. So if I look at this, for example, there's this kind of arc in the grain of the wood. And rather than drawing it like this, I'm going to have that path in my mind and create it as an accumulation of marks that run in the path of that grain. And then when it crosses into that shadow, I'm going to carry that down a little bit more just by making a darker mark. and it starts to create that sense of transparency. And then over here, I can come out of that shadow into this area is still darker than over here, but it's less dark, and I can carry that texture down. I'm going to enhance it a bit more from what I'm seeing in the photograph, but it'll help you to see what I'm talking about in terms of that transparency. So where that grain crosses into the shadow, I'm going to lean in a bit more, make it darker, and then lighten up as I come back out. I'm going to do that over here as well. And that transparency, even if it's very subtle, does a lot to create the impression of of realism. It makes it feel more realistic. We start to perceive this as that it's what we're drawing here is the table. We're not drawing a shadow. We're drawing a table that's in shadow, and we sometimes forget that. We see that shape of the shadow. We get locked into that shape, and we forget that shadow really is the surface, not its own thing. It's not its own shape. Sometimes we block that in as a shape, as in the early stages as we're looking at just shapes of light and dark and blocking in those shadow shapes. But really, again, what we're drawing is the surface, not the shadow, if that makes sense. You can start to draw some of the kind of pits in the wood, again, following the grain. If you always have an awareness of the grain, it becomes a bit more forgiving. If I go like this across the page, it has no relationship to the grain of the wood, and you run the risk of it kind of degrading that form. I can add kind of a sharper edge along here. So again, with this pencil, I've been using it on the side for a long time, and that's gradually sharpening this to a point, so I can use that to my advantage. So I'm just looking at the shapes of the wood grain of the kind of the tree rings. I don't necessarily need to get it correct. I can have a little bit of fun with this and make them up as I go along. So I know we've been on for a while, so. But again, if we're aware of the grain of the wood, it can be far more forgiving if we invent. So maybe I want to come over here. This feels a bit ambiguous right now, so adding a little bit of specificity there can be helpful. There's a bit of a kind of a curve in that grain. If I had a piece of wood that had a more distinct grain, then I might, I'd have a bit more to work on, and I could really follow that more precisely. But like in this area, there's not much grain showing, so I'm actually going to invent something, or I'm going to enhance what I'm starting to see in terms of these bands of varying color. Because I need to create that transparency. That shadow's feeling a bit too opaque right now. Look over here. I guess that perspective is looking all right. Might adjust that a little bit. All right. Well, you used a blending tool in the shadows, the Silent Runner. I'm actually, in this case, I'm just using the side of my hand. I don't want to use my fingertips because they tend to be too oily. I do have shading stumps, these tortillions that I'll often use, but I didn't want to use them here because it has a tendency to really push the charcoal into the paper, and I won't be able to erase out any of the highlights, and I wanted to make sure I didn't have that happen in these eggs here. So that's why I set that aside. I don't even have it within reach because I have a feeling if I did have it in reach, I'd kind of forget and go for it, I'd grab it. But I want to be able to do this, where I'm bringing that wood grain on top of the egg and then using the eraser to cut back out and define that edge, not by drawing a line, but by erasing out the shape. If that makes sense here. So, and in this case, so there's kind of a definable line along here. It's all very subtle, and it's just to the left of this egg. And I think what I need to do, actually, I think it's going to work against me in this drawing because it comes so close to the edge there, it creates what we refer to as a tangent. Whenever you have two objects that are different places in space, but they align on the paper, it tends to flatten out. Everything pops to the surface. And so instead what I want to do is incorporate overlapping and maybe lighten up what's forming as a darker edge here. Maybe lighten that up and then bring a darker edge here where it cuts in underneath that egg, and that's going to pop the edge of the egg forward a bit more. So I kind of avoid the impression of a tangent there. Hopefully that makes sense. I don't really like to kind of fudge things a whole lot. That's just something, it's a personal preference. But in this case, I feel like it's necessary. Often I like to really understand what I'm looking at and replicate that. But in this case, I feel like I need that to help to define the edge of that egg. This is starting to feel too kind of soft in here. The edge isn't sharp enough, so I'm going to darken that a little bit. All right, let's see. All right, we have Marcia from Austin. Oh, nail art. Oh, I'm glad you liked the technique. Sorry, I don't know if I got to everybody in making comments, but I really appreciate you doing that. Sometimes it's hard to look back and see where you know, where we're at right now. So Vivica says it sounds like Vivica, you're following along with the strokes. That's good to know. Let me know if you see something or if I'm moving too fast. I don't know if there's any lag or something in the video that might be impacting that. So if something does kind of lag in the video and you're curious about what I'm doing, just let me know. I'm going to artificially kind of darken this a little bit. Again, kind of creating this bounce light along here, helping to pop that egg out a little bit. So maybe I'll do this, and then I'm looking off camera at the screen that's just off to the left where I get a better view of what I'm working on. Hope I didn't cross in front of the camera too much. All right, let me see. I feel like I just need a little bit more definition in this area here. These little dips and dashes and stuff to help to create some kind of pitting in the wood. Again, thinking about the grain, maybe enhancing them more than we need to. And if you just kind of tap it on the page, it's going to feel more naturalistic versus really a heavy line. So you want to just be kind of careful with that. Maybe I can define this edge. I want to kind of invent some wood grain along here as well. So with these marks here, again, I'm trying to think about the path, and then these are just kind of short kind of ticks that are lifting off the ground. And I've lost that sharp edge there, so I can turn it on its side, kind of block in some values. I feel like I lost the grain a little bit, and I'm changing the angle up too much. If I need to, I can always go back to this one that I already have sharpened. That's got a sharper point. And then that helps to establish some of these pits, divots, these cracks that are in the wood. But I think I'm feeling pretty good about this so far. Work on it a bit more. Feeling like that wood grain is a bit transparent. This feels unfinished up here. And that's where I want to kind of focus my attention now. I can sharpen this edge just a little bit, kind of trying to be selective with my focus here. And as you can see, I created this bounce light not by erasing back out, but by building the darks around it. And so I blocked in that whole shadow first and then darkened in the shadow core in certain areas. But I feel like this over here could utilize some kind of focus. So I'm going to kind of darken this. There's a bit of a shadow under here that helps to define the edge of the eggs. And then maybe kind of carry out some of that wood grain. And then as I start to establish some of that wood grain, it also helps to define the edge of the eggs. And then maybe darken and sharpen up this edge along in here. And I feel like just a thin line to crisp this up is going to be helpful. I want to be careful not to make it too dark, but it's a sharp edge that hopefully allows that to pop a little bit more without sacrificing that form. And maybe that's what I need over here as well. I'll erase this out. So I think this is feeling pretty good. Check the notes again. If you came in late, in the description, there is a reference photo. There's a list of materials I'm using, indicate what's coming up next. I do this every Monday, Wednesday, Friday at 3 p.m. Eastern. Check out Artist Network. There's a page on there that has more information and drawing resources for you. So if you go to artistnetwork.com, look at the top. There's a link to the Drawing Together page there. Additional resources are available. We really just want to help people in this time access what is useful to you as an artist. So we want to meet you at where you're at right now as an artist, whether you're just a beginner, whether you've been doing this forever, whether you want to make a change, try out a new medium, build a skill in a particular area, just be inspired. We try to have a little bit for everybody. And so check out those resources. I'm going to draw here. I really appreciate you all being along here. Sonic Movie and Kirby. Hello, guys. The weight of the paper, honestly, I don't, let me look. I have it down here. This is 80-pound paper, so that's fairly light. I'm going to try to order a heavyweight cotton rag paper, as I'd really like to work on that. I like to experiment with different papers, so right now I'm just using this basic drawing paper that I have around the house. It's 80-pound. Seems to be getting the job done. I like it, but I think it's really healthy to experiment with different papers. So, you're welcome, Vicky. Thank you all. How long would you do a still drawing before? Maybe a still drawing before. I'm not sure I understand the question there, Silent Runner. Generally the drawings that the pace that I work at this scale, a lot of it comes down to the scale of the drawing because I attack each drawing very similarly. Hour and a half, 2 hours is all the time that I need. But it all depends on your focus. I know when I was in art school, I could sit and I had kind of built up an endurance to work where 8 hours could go by and it felt like nothing. I don't quite have that. I find that I'm far more impatient now, and I tend to get things done more quickly. And so a couple hours is about really all that I typically spend working. 2 to 3 hours maybe. When I'm painting on plein air, I'll work for 2 to 3 hours total, and then come back in and take a break, and then maybe take another work on another drawing or painting later in the day. But I kind of take it in 2 hour chunks. But you're welcome. Thank you, Marie. Thank you for signing that. I almost called you Charles. Let's be too careful with that. I'll get it one time. You've been in too many of these sessions for me to forget that, so I apologize. Let's see. But yeah, I appreciate it. Thank you. I'm feeling pretty good about this. I could kind of pick at this from now on, but I'm not sure as if it's going to add anything substantive to the final piece. So I'm just going to let this be, call it a day. I think I'm ready for the weekend. I imagine you are as well. Hopefully your weekend is full of art making. So I appreciate it. Thank you all. I'll see you again on Monday, again, 3 p.m. Eastern. In the description for this one, I have the link to the next reference image. And so we will, that's the one we'll be working on there. So I appreciate it. Thank you. Enjoy your drawing time, and then have a great weekend. I'm going to let this run a little bit while everybody seems to be saying their goodbyes here, so I appreciate it.